So good evening again. This is Tara McLeod from the Farmington Libraries. We're really excited tonight to have Dr. Nick Bellantoni discuss his book, And So the Tomb Remained. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows to stay muted during the presentation, and you're welcome to ask questions or comment after the presentation. And you can either unmute and ask a question, but it may be better to just type in your question in the chat box, but whatever you're comfortable with. So you can do either. And let's go on. So we have Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, who serves as the Emeritus State Archaeologist with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at the University of Connecticut. And he received his doctorate in anthropology from UConn in 1987 and was shortly thereafter appointed state archaeologist. Currently, he serves as the adjunct associate research professor in the Department of Anthropology at UConn. He is a former president of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and the National Association of State Archaeologists. So welcome, Dr. Bellantoni. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And hopefully we could give you some kind of a start on your Halloween by talking about historic tombs and some of our work there. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a slideshow for you. So if that works, we will get underway. How's that? Can everybody see that? Excellent. Excellent. So yes, when I retired about 7 years ago, and when I did, one of the things I wanted to do was start to write about some of my experiences as a state archaeologist. And this is the second book I've put together on that. And what this is about 5 tomb projects, historic tombs that I had to go into either because of restoration projects or because of criminal investigations. So, and so the tomb remained is the title, is taken, actually, the title is taken from a Thomas Hardy novel, Thomas Hardy poem, where he laments his wife's family tomb that is falling down, and he laments that the people inside have been forgotten and unknown through time. And so only the tomb remained. But so he kind of took that from Thomas Hardy. But it's basically what the book is about is, as a subtitle says, exploring archaeology and forensic science within Connecticut's historical family mausolea. So I've had the opportunity to work in a number of tombs. So, but I only selected 5 for this particular book, and they include the Squire Elijah Pitkin tomb in Center Cemetery in East Hartford, the Gershom Bulkeley tomb down in Colchester, the Samuel Huntington tomb in Norwichtown burying ground. Those 3 projects had to do with tombs that were discovered, in some cases not known, but also in terms of being able to restore these tombs. And we got called in. The Chauncey Mausoleum in Indian Hill Cemetery in Middletown, and the Edwin D. Morgan tomb in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford were both police investigations where vandals had broken into the tombs to steal skeletal remains for ritualistic purposes. So tomb restorations and tomb vandalisms come into play. Nothing from Farmington, but hopefully you'll enjoy and get something out of some of these stories. The reason I've been in so many tombs is that I have, as state archaeologist, when I was working in the state archaeologist today, Sarah Sportman, has mandated responsibilities from the state to investigate human skeletal remains that are 50 years old or more. So if a construction project is underway and bones are encountered, the first thing, the police get involved, the state medical examiner gets involved, And if they see that the remains are old and probably an old burial that was unmarked, then the state archaeologist gets called in to assume the investigation. So we assist in the exhumations and removals. We try to find families. We work with Native American tribes here in Connecticut if they turn out to be native remains. But in the tomb projects, we are, to see that the remains are properly handled during the reconstructions or during vandalism investigations, and that everyone is appropriately put back inside the tomb. We do not keep bones anymore. Everyone gets reburied. And in some cases, we work with the descendants when that is possible, when we could find them out. So because of legislative responsibilities and our background is why we ended up going into many of these tombs. So before tombs, well, there was a problem of marking graves. And this goes back to medieval Europe, when the only people whose burials were identified and marked were usually that of the nobility, artists, scientists, very prominent people. The average person, did not get a tombstone, did not get, the prominent people were buried inside churches, usually in the cellars, usually with stone coffins. But common people did not have, for the most part, very well marked burial grounds. So many people who, when they were preparing for their death, would say to their families, I want to be buried near the church or in the churchyard, wanting to be buried at Santo or near the saint. Churches held the relics and sometimes the bones of the saints. And the idea was, if you were buried near the church, then the saint would help you get through the pearly gates to be ad Santo. But the problem was nobody marked these graves, and churchyards became boneyards because there were so many burials in them. About the time of Shakespeare, you remember Hamlet, who is digging Ophelia's grave, and suddenly he comes upon the remains of Yorick, the court jester who had died a few months earlier, and he picks up his skull and he says, "Poor Yorick, I knew him well." Well, this was very common. You would dig a new grave and hit the graves of others that had been in the ground before that. So about the time of Shakespeare, people started questioning the sanctity of the grave. If your remains were dispersed by new burials impacting it, would you be prepared for the day of resurrection? And so families now started to put a simple stone marker onto the grave, not engraved, just a stone, as if to say, look, somebody's buried here, dig elsewhere. Okay. And so that led to basically in the late 17th century, where tombstones now were elaborate, that iconography of that we know of in New England. For those of you, Memento Mori, go on Route 5 down Main Street, and that old ancient burial ground there. You'll see many markers that go back into not only the early 18th century, but in some cases the late 17th century. When the Puritans came here, they didn't like churchyard burials. That was too much like Catholicism. So farmers here sometimes buried in the backyards, or like Memento Mori in your town, they were placed in a separate burial ground away from a church, sometimes on commons, sometimes, in the backyards. So with that, cemeteries, develop. At this time, they were calling them burying grounds. That's how they were referred to. It wasn't until the 19th century and the actual, how do you want to say, systematic cemeteries were developed with avenues and more formal of putting people into the ground. Then we start using the term cemetery. Before that, they're burying grounds. And family tombs, you know what? That didn't really happen very much until about the time of the American Revolution. So with planned cemeteries, we call them cemeteries. prior to that, like Memento Mori, they are burying grounds. So cemeteries are really cool because they are really our cultural history. When you go to a cemetery, it's not just simply, paying respect to the dead, the tombstones that are there, the monuments that are there, but what these are changes in our attitudes as a culture to death, to memorials. And cemeteries tell our story in a very unique way. So the first tomb that we're going to talk about, it was a tomb that, well, they didn't realize it was a tomb. It was the tomb of the Pitkin family of Squire Elisha Pitkin. If you follow my cursor here on the facade of this of the tomb, you got the brick lining. There's no name, and so what happened was that archivists and the people that tending the cemetery thought this was a holding vault. And holding vaults were places where when people died in the middle of the winter and the ground was hard and the snow was deep, you couldn't get a shovel in the ground. So coffins were maintained in these holding vaults, waiting until the spring thaw. And then they were taken out and put in their appropriate plot in the ground. So many thought that's what this was, that this was in fact a holding vault, not realizing it was a family tomb. Not until, well, with the fact that the tomb was now starting to collapse, that it was in really bad shape, that workers in East Hartford started to, restore the tomb. But in the process of doing so, some bricks dislodged and fell inside. And so they went in to kind of look at to see what the damage was. And when they opened the door to this tomb that had been really sealed for so long, they found skeletal remains. And instead of a holding vault, they realized it was part of a tomb. And there were skeletal remains and coffin parts all over. So that's when I got the call from Dora Sussman, who was the town historian in East Hartford at the time. And she explained that they thought the vault was empty. And yet now they found all these skeletons. Would I come down and assist them in identifying who was here? So we said, of course, we'll come right down. And she said to me, and yes, and you're going to love this because inside the tomb is an Egyptian sarcophagus. And I said, well, I really don't think so, but I'm coming down anyway. And when I got there and got inside the tomb, this is what they were calling the Egyptian sarcophagus. You could see my cursor moving around, and down here from a view looking down on it, it does look like an Egyptian sarcophagus because it's molded in the form of the human frame. But what it is really a Fisk metallic burial case. A guy by the name of Fisk down in New Jersey started to develop metal coffins, and one model was in the human form. And these were patented in the 1840s. Fortunately, at where the arms would be crossed here, there is a nameplate. And when we cleaned it up, it said Dr. Edwin Pitkin died 1851. And that was the first inkling that we were in fact in the Pitkin family tomb. And of course, doing the research, Squire Elisha Pitkin built a tomb for his family, we believe in the 1790s, based on the documents we have in the genealogy. He was quite the guy. Squire Pitkin was one of the first of the family to graduate from Yale College in 1853. He developed the first glassworks with his brother William, which is the Pitkin Glassworks. Today it's in Manchester, Connecticut, and on the National Register of Historic Places. But back then it was part of East Hartford, or the East Side. East Hartford was called the East Parish because it was still part of Hartford across the Connecticut River. It wasn't until it became a municipality after the American Revolution that it became East Hartford, Connecticut. But the Pickens were Connecticut's first family. We had a Governor Pitkin. Most of the prominent legislators, merchants were all Pickens, and especially residing on the east side, Hartford's east side. His son, Squire Elisha Pitkin's son, is the Dr. Edwin Pitkin with the Fisk metallic burial case. When the French General Rochambeau drove his armies across Connecticut from Newport, Rhode Island, to meet up with George Washington in New York, he stayed at the Squire Pitkin's house in East Hartford. So he stayed there for about 3 days. So very prominent, the Pickens, especially Squire Elisha. And in 1790, he decided to build a tomb for his family. And when we went in, what we saw was a lot of disarray. And you could see from this photograph that the coffins were placed on brick partitions. They had 2 rows going down the center aisle, and then every 2 feet going, to the side walls were bricks. And this way they could put the coffins on the brick partitions and not a part of laying on the damp earth. With all this disarray, somebody had said, well, it looks like somebody vandalized the tomb. And I said, no, this is not vandalism. This is what happens when the wooden coffins dry out, when they desiccate, the sideboards pop and people come tumbling down. In many cases, as in this tomb, coffins were stacked 3, 4 high in some cases. And when those sideboards fall and collapse, so do the coffins and the skeletal remains. You could see that here at the bottom of the slide. You got the brick partition, then you've got a bottom board, human skeletal remains, a top board, a bottom board for the next person, and of course, the back of the cranium of that individual sitting on top. So we had stacked coffins, and it looked like basically about 16 individuals. We were assisted by Dr. Albert Harper, who was at that time retired now, but at that time he was the executive director of the Henry Lee Institute of Forensic Science at the University of New Haven, came up with a couple of students. And while I was inside the tomb mapping, making identifications of each burial, I was handing out skeletal remains to Al, who he and his students would now start doing the forensic work, identifying age, sex, diseases, traumas, dental health, and so forth. And when we were done, we were able to put a schematic together of the burial of the tomb. The pink are females and the bluish tint is males. And you could see here the Fisk metallic coffin, and you could see the stacking of many of these burials. And in the back, along the back row, there was only a single coffin, and that turns out to be, we identified as Squire Elisha Pitkin, the founder of the family and the builder of the tomb. So he was along the back wall. And when we were done, using the family genealogy, working with the archivists for the cemetery, we were able to make positive identifications on those 16 individuals. And the Friends of Center Cemetery erected a stone. This is about 5 feet by 5 feet, with the names of all the individuals we were able to identify inside the tomb. And then they had a family reunion of the Pickens, who came and learned more about their ancestors, but certainly were there to help dedicate the new stone and the restoration of the tomb itself. So this was a fun one for us, because here we had, nobody even knew this was a tomb. Again, they thought it was a holding vault. And by the time we were done, we not only were able to restore the tomb, help with that, but also identify specific Pitkin family members. And so now we know, we have their names, kind of resurrecting them, if you will, if that's the term to use. But, now they have names and meaning, and we have forensic information about each one of them. So that was a tomb where they thought it was a holding vault. In the Gershom Bulkeley family tomb, they didn't even know the tomb existed until it was found, if you will, with the restoration of the tomb in 2002. The tomb was probably built about the time of the American Revolution, or the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775 or so. But here's the story behind this one. The tomb was well known in the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, in the 1920s, I think it was 1927, on Halloween night, students from Bacon Academy broke into this tomb, family tomb, and stole the skull. And they put the skull, as you could see, on a staff here, and paraded around town. They paraded around the town green, scaring their classmates with this real skull. In fact, they caused so much of a commotion that the town fathers came in, and nobody was more mortified than the pastor of the Congregational Church, because it was his son holding the pole with the skull on it. And needless to say, the young men were reprimanded, I'm sure, very harshly. And not only that, they were required to seal up and bury the tomb. So what they did is they went in, there was a wooden door, they sealed that up with bricks, they put flat stones from the graveyard, footstones, into the entranceway to seal it up. And then truckloads of soil came in, and the boys were instructed to bury the tomb. They did such a good job that within 3 generations, no one even realized anymore there was a tomb in the burial ground. The western slope had this little knoll to it, and nobody really understood that under that knoll was the Gershom Bulkeley family tomb. It was completely hidden. It wasn't until a restoration project in 2002, when they were cleaning up and putting a period fence around the cemetery, that they found 3 marble slabs. And when they put those slabs together, it said the tomb of Gershom Bulkeley and his descendants. And because it was found just downslope of this little hill, they realized that the hill was in fact a burying ground underneath it, that there was a tomb under it. So we got called in by the Pitkin family, who had heard what we did in the Pitkin tomb, and the Bulkeley family asked if we could go in and do a similar kind of identification of their ancestors, because they had no records. There were no records as to who was buried here. No church records, no cemetery records. Nobody knew who was here. All we knew now was it was the Bulkeley. So I went down and met with them, and I saw this small little knoll that had been buried, and I didn't think it was very big. I thought it was rather small. So sure, I figured it'd be less than the number of people in the Pitkin tomb. Here you see what kind of looked like. This is when the facade started to erode. So this hill, now it was realized, was in fact the tomb. And when I looked at that, I said, sure, there'll be no problem. It wasn't the first time I was wrong. The Bulkeley family, very prominent also. Gershom Bulkeley, who built the tomb, his grandfather was Gershom Bulkeley, and one of the most prominent individuals of 17th century Connecticut. He was a famous minister, surgeon, Gershom's father was the Reverend John Bulkeley, who was the first minister of the Colchester Congregational Church. Other family members would include Ephilet Bulkeley, who was the founder of Aetna Life Insurance, and Morgan Gardner Bulkeley, who, as well as being a governor of the state of Connecticut and a U.S. senator, he also was, in fact, the first president of the National Baseball League. And today he's enshrined in Cooperstown in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So again, a very, very, very prominent family wanting to bury their dead in tombs as opposed to the cold, hard ground. So here's our volunteers starting to excavate out so we can get into the tomb. Here are the footstones that they piled in the stairwell to make sure that nobody could go back into it. Of course, they weren't counting on me. And when we got to the doorway, it was bricked. We were able to dislodge a prick up on high. And I was able for the first time to look inside the tomb. And when I did, I was just awestruck. And somebody behind me said, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see wonderful things." Well, I didn't see wonderful things, actually. What I saw, my first view of the tomb, was collapsed coffins and skeletal remains just littering the floor. And while we had 16 people in the buried in the Pitkin tomb, we would have 30 people buried in the Bulkeley tomb. And I realized when I saw this, my goodness, what a job we had before us. And this would take almost a complete summer's work before we could finish this project. So here again, you see this is one corner of the inside of the Bulkeley tomb. You could see the stacking going on. Here's a bottom board, here's a skull, here's another bottom board on top of that, another skeleton. This cranium is rolled from the top. So the first thing I had to do was, when I got inside, was try to make sense of this all, try to identify specific burials as we went along, and number them and so forth. One of the things we were very fortunate in here in this tomb is that we had very decorated coffin lids. And so what you see here is what they did is they took brass tacks and they hammered the tacks into the lid of the coffin with the initials of the person laying here, in this case, BP, surrounded by a heart motif, a Christian sign of endearment. AE, age of 87, died March 1798. AD 1798. So we were working with the Pitkin family, and in fact, we had an easel outside the tomb with the Pitkin family tree. And so when we knew we had BP died in 1798 at 87 years, we went right to the genealogy and found Peter Bulkeley, who died in 1798. Another one was JB, age of 69, 1807. And this turns out to be John Bulkeley. Yeah, John turns out to be one of Gershom's brothers. So we really had now some help here with the genealogy. And now it was a matter of matching up the skeletal remains that I was identifying and putting together in some places, because there was a lot of disbursement and commingling of the bone. But working inside, mapping, organizing skeletons to bring out. Dr. Harper was helping us again, assisted us again. And we had students not only from the University of New Haven, but from UConn, Wesleyan University, Yale, and even a student from New York University in Manhattan. And as I would bring the remains out, sometimes on bottom boards, like you see here, we slide plywood underneath to give it support and bring it out. And they would go through and start the preliminary forensic data. And what we found here was that the families, while they had clearly dental attention and medical attention from doctors, they still suffered greatly. from life stress pathologies as well as diseases and traumas. So you see here, this is the lower vertebrae of one of the adult men. You could see the overlapping here of arthritis, the lipping here. So these men were the stone wall builders. They were farmers, even though they were of a prominent family. They worked hard, and you could see it in their skeleton. Here you've got the vertebral column of that, what you just saw, but you could see there's so much overlap with the arthritic lipping that the bones are fused. They're actually fused. This individual could not bend down. So you get a sense of the hardship, the life stress of these people in the latter 18th and early 19th century. Here is a fracture, an adult male. You could see the fracture is in the midshap. This is the femur bone or your thigh bone. This is the head of the femur that goes into your hip socket, and this is your knee joint. Harsh fracture of the bone here. The bone was bound, didn't have a cast, but it was bound and saw medical attention, and that's why it healed. This person lived about 5 to 7 years after they suffered this trauma. You can see a bone spur growing, and also secondary osteoarthritis. In X-ray here, you could see the fracture, how severe it is, where the bone actually shortened up as it broke through. And you can see the arthritic condition here. It would be in the knee joint. So you get an appreciation of how hard it was back then. We see people, the skeletons are, would have knee replacements and hip replacements today. And their bones would be far better secured after they fractured. But a very difficult time, and all they could do was suffer through it. This is what the tomb looked like when we cleaned it at the end, when we had everyone out and getting it ready for the reburial as the forensic analysis was being done at the University of Connecticut. Here's our schematic of the Bulkeley tomb. You can see a lot more coffins than we had in the Pitkin tomb, and in many cases they were as much as 4 high. So it was really quite a disarray once we put it together. The tomb was restored and to its 18th century appearance. If you were to go there today, this is what you would see. Beautiful restoration. And like at the Pitkin tomb, the family had a 5 foot by 5 foot granite stone identifying all the names of the Bulkeley family that we were able to identify forensically through genealogy, history, and as well as those coffin lids that were very helpful to us. So again, people that have been lost in history have been lost. The tomb remained, but we didn't know much about who they were until we did the work. Another tomb restoration was of Samuel Huntington. And if you don't know who Samuel Huntington is, shame on you, because he's one of our foremost founding fathers, or what I like to say, a forgotten founding father. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was president of the Confederation Congress when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. Means he was the first legislative president of the United States. He was the 18th governor of Connecticut and served 10 terms. Well, back then, a governor served for 1 year, but he was not only elected governor, but re-elected 9 times. He was a patriot, a statesman, a lawyer, someone who should never been forgotten, but a lot gets forgotten in history because we are a very future-oriented culture. We tend not to look back as much as we should. But he was a very prominent individual. His descendants say he's the first president of the United States. Of course, George Washington was the first executive president, constitutional president. Huntington was the first legislative president. And he was buried here with his wife, Martha, in this tomb in Norwichtown Cemetery. You could see the tomb was in bad condition. The facade was literally falling away from the body of the tomb. You could see the facade here, and you could see the gap now as it's separated. The Norwich Historical Society raised money to restore the tomb. And in doing so, they had to remove the facade. And that's when they asked me as the state archaeologist if I would go into the tomb and handle the remains of those that were inside. And the inside of the tomb was much different than the Pitkin or Bulkeley tombs. In this case, instead of brick partitions, they put good Eastern Connecticut flat field stones into the wall, mortared them into the wall, and then balanced the coffins on the field stones. And up here on the upper right, we have Martha. Over here on the upper left is where Samuel was. They're the only two in the tomb. They did not have children, but they did take care of and raised a niece and a nephew. But they died out west in Ohio and are buried out there. So the problem with the deterioration of the tomb now is that as it spanned, each coffin spanned 3 of these mortared stones, well, the gaps in between started to collapse. So we had some remains on top of the stones, but many of which that had fallen down to the floor. But because there were only 2 people in the tomb, and because they were separate sides of the tomb, they were not commingled, and it was much easier to make sense of it. So here you see us doing our mapping, recovery, and including the skeletal remains themselves. I could tell you, Samuel surprised me because as a lawyer and a diplomat, he turned out to have a very robust skeleton. That is to say, he was a very strong guy, very powerful, had large muscle attachments, he had great bone density. I didn't expect to see that in a diplomat, but he was a very, very rugged man. And Martha, poor Martha, she suffered from arthritic conditions in her knees and her hip, so much so that, again, she would have been someone that would have been a prime candidate for knee and hip replacements today. In 1790, she could only grin and bear it, but it must have been very difficult in the last few years of her life for her to even walk. She was so littered with arthritis. One of the neat artifacts we found were nameplates, and this was His Excellency Samuel Huntington, Esquire, Governor of the state of Connecticut, born and died and aged 64 years. We found one for Martha too. Martha Huntington, consort of Samuel Huntington, governor of this state. Consort was the wife of, meaning the wife of. If your husband died first, you were referred to as a relic. Not very flattering in today's terminology, but she was the consort or the wife of Samuel Huntington. So here's the tomb restoration. They had to remove it. We worked with a local funeral director so that as we removed the remains from the tomb with identifications, they were brought to the funeral home where we were able to do some more forensic work. And here you see the new facade being put up. And when everything was completed, we had hopefully a reburial fitting of a founder of our country and governor of the state of Connecticut. There was a big reception and reburial with the governor's office, the senators and congressmen represented. The governor's foot guard served as pallbearers, and they would bring the coffins to restored period, new coffins of that period, hexagonal shaped, and with the remains now placed inside. And you could see the governor's foot guard bringing the coffins into So here's the opening. I'm in the tomb at this time, and a colleague of mine, Dave Cook, we were both in the tomb, and we were accepting through a very small opening the governor's, or I should say, Samuel Huntington and his wife's coffins, and placing them. And you could see here we're placing Samuel back where he was on the shelf. And this is what the stored coffin or stored tomb looks like. Note the small opening here. This is a small stairway in which the coffins came in. So I'm going to tell you this one last story here, and that is that while we were in the tomb, it was decided that people that had contributed money to the restoration project would be allowed to place a brick into the opening right down here to close it up. Well, we're still inside the tomb getting things organized, and all of a sudden I hear this chinking sound, this clinking, chinking. I'm saying, what's going on out there? And I look up, and they're starting to brick up the tomb while Dave and I are still inside. Fortunately, I yelled loud enough for them to cease their operation, and we were able to get out before too long. The Chauncey family mausoleum is a beautiful brownstone mausoleum in Indian Hill Cemetery, with the Mutter, Chauncey, and Alsop families involved. This all started as a police investigation. Someone found a skull, human skull, behind a car wash in Cromwell, Connecticut. And Cromwell is just north of Middletown. When the police got involved, the medical examiner saw that the bones were old. There was cortical loss and decomposition, and said, this is not a modern criminal investigation. This person's been dead a long time. That's when the Middletown police were instructed to get a hold of myself as a state archaeologist. I came down and identified the skull as being that of an adult woman, probably 45 to 55 years of age, that she was of European ancestry. And I said, there's something strange about this. This individual has been dead a long time, over 100 years, and yet there's no sign of any soil adhering to the skull. So, you're in the ground, and the soil eventually invades, in the auditory canal of your ear, the nerve endings, the foramens, they fill up with soil. And sometimes even the cranial vault fills up with soil. So I said, this person's been dead for a long time, but it's never been in the ground. And that's when they said, would you come with us to the cemetery? And they brought me to the Chauncey, and this is the center portion of the mausoleum, to the Chauncey. And what they had brought me to, the door had been busted into, and vandals had broken in to the Chauncey mausoleum. Now the Chaunceys, again, were very prominent families that would build these tombs for their loved ones. The Reverend Charles Chauncey was the second president of Harvard College. Henry Chauncey, whose family is buried in this tomb, is actually one of the he was a merchant, and he was actually one of the builders of the Panamanian Railroad. So you go back to the 1840s, 1850s, you had the only ways to get from New York to San Francisco was, first of all, the Oregon Trail, which was dangerous and took months and months to crisscross the country. Or you can get on a schooner or a sailing boat, go down the Atlantic, around Cape Horn or around to South America, and come back up to San Francisco, and that could take you months. What Chauncey and his partners, Stevens and Aspinwall, came up with is to build a railroad through the Isthmus of Panama. Now, this is before the canal. So you would take a steamer from New York to Panama in the Caribbean Sea, hop on a train, take it over the mountain to the Pacific side, to Panama City. There you would get another schooner and sail up to San Francisco. You could do that in like 4 or 5 days. It was a very quick now. So they made quite a bit of money on this. It was very successful. And Henry Chauncey became very, very, very rich. Well, you could see that in his mausoleum. When we came inside, it was marble floors, brick partitions, and the coffins were placed in vaults in the wall with big, large marble epitaphs. What had happened is vandals had broken in and using small sledgehammers smashed the marble epitaphs, pulled the stone off, and then pulled coffins out of their vaults, so that the floor was literally littered with human remains, burial clothing, marble tombstone, coffin hardware, wood. It was a mess. It was so terrible to look at. And you could see here in this photograph, you've got the leg of a child, a 5-year-old, that was torn out of his coffin. You have clothing here and leg bones still within the pant legs and arm bones and the sleeves, littering the floor. So what I did is I set up kind of a grid and started to excavate from the top down. And this way I could record vertical and horizontal position of the human remains and the coffin materials. And what this allowed me to do is reconstruct a sequence of the vandalism. That is to say, who was pulled out first on the floor, who came subsequently on top, etc. So I was able to develop for the police a sequence of what the vandals did in their sacrilege of the interior of this tomb. Henry Chauncey, who I showed you the photograph of, was in this cast iron coffin, and this is his skull plate, the top of his calvaria. He had an autopsy, and that's why the skull was sawed. He died at 68 years of age in 1863 in Mount Holly, New Jersey, and he died suddenly. And so they did an autopsy in New Jersey and then brought his remains back to the family tomb in Indian Hill Cemetery. And also his wife, Lucy, was in a wooden coffin in the vault next to him. And it turns out we were able to account for all of Lucy's skeletal remains except for her skull. And that was the skull that was found behind the car wash. So based on our work and based on other things, parts of the investigation, the police were able to arrest someone. And it turns out the motive for breaking into the tomb was satanic cult activities. They needed bones for their rituals. And a similar thing took place with the vandalism of the Edwin Denison Morgan tomb. The Morgan tomb is in Indian Hill Cemetery in Hartford. It was vandalized in 2008. 5 years later, we entered the tomb to become a part of the investigation. And that's because when the Hartford police came in 2008, they could not solve it. I mean, it was a tomb break-in. They had no leads, nothing to go by. And it sat as a cold case for 5 years. And then something else happened in New Britain, Connecticut. The police in New Britain, Connecticut were called into a domestic dispute between a young couple. It was a very bad dispute. It was verbal. It was physical abuse. When the police entered, they broke up the couple and they took the young man and they were taking him down to headquarters. They were taking him down to the station. And as they were dragging him away, the young woman yells out, "And he has human skulls in the closet," as if to add insult to injury. But that stopped the police dead in their tracks. And they went into the closet and they found a suitcase and also a 3-legged ceramic pot When they opened the suitcase, they found skeletal remains. But they also found a nameplate that you see in the lower left here. And the nameplate reads Mary B.P. Morgan, who died in 1883, I believe it was, or 86. But that keyed us that, in fact, these remains may have come from the Morgan tomb. And that's when we got involved with the medical examiner's office. Edwin Denison Morgan, again, prominent. He was the 21st governor of the state of New York, excuse me, not Connecticut. Huntington was Connecticut. Morgan was the governor of New York just before the Civil War broke out. In fact, he was referred to as the volunteer governor because he enlisted over 150,000 men from New York to the Union Army. He was the first chairman of the Republican National Committee, and he was the chairman of the National Committee when Abraham Lincoln was nominated in 1860 for the presidency. In fact, Abraham Lincoln wanted Morgan to be his Secretary of the Treasury, but Morgan turned him down. He would later become a U.S. Senator from New York, very prominent, very wealthy merchant businessman, but also really a beloved politician. When we recognized that the discovery in New Britain might be related to the vandalism at Hartford, we went to the Morgan tomb, entered in, and we found, just like the Chauncey tomb, they were in vaults, the coffins in the wall, but instead of putting the coffins kind of feet first into the perpendicular to the wall, into the vault, they were parallel. So they sat parallel to the wall. And what we did at this point is we went into both coffins, both our metal coffins, and did an inventory of the skeletal remains. So what we wanted to do was understand what remains were still in the tomb and what remains had been removed, and to see if we can match them up between Edwin Denison Morgan and Mary B.P. Morgan. Mary, by the way, was Edwin's grandson's wife, so kind of his granddaughter-in-law. So with that inventory now, we went to the medical examiner's office and took a look at the remains that were actually in the suitcase. These belong to Mary B.P. Morgan. You could see her here. And also, it turns out that the only skeletal remains missing from Edwin Denison Morgan's coffin was his skull, or his cranium. And that we would find in this clay vessel that was found in the closet. It's a clay vessel, has 3 legs to it, and you could see the interior here has Edwin's cranium. But not only that, it has his cranium. There were also 5 chicken heads, chicken feet, horseshoes, carved sticks, candles, coins, feathers, ritual crosses, and cigar butts. And we removed these archaeologically to get an inventory of what was inside, as well as reclaimed Edwin's skeletal remains. Before we even opened it, however, we worked with our colleagues at Quinnipiac University's Bioanthropology Research Institute, part of the Department of Diagnostic Imaging, and they did CT scans. This is the vessel. You can see the outline of the vessel. Here's Edwin's cranium, and you could see a 3-dimensional color reconstruction with the horseshoes here and the cranium here. So we had an idea of what was inside even before we started to remove. What this all turns out to be is part of a Santeria rituals, and a part of Santeria called Palo Mayombe. This is part of an Afro-Caribbean religion that does have some Roman Catholic beliefs with the resurrection of the dead. Palo is a healing ceremony. Okay, so this is to heal people of physical or mental illnesses. However, it is also kind of the dark side of Santeria, where they use human remains as part of the healing process. So it's a belief that the spirit world, the dead are connected with the living through the spirit world, and that skeletal remains have power to them that house the spirits that can come out to do the healing. So the rituals are to harness energy to change the person for the better. And the more powerful people are in life, the more power their bones have to heal. So the Morgans were extremely powerful economically and politically, and since their bones have that power. The issue here is the vandalism of human remains for these particular rituals. So we were able to get some pretty positive forensic identifications on both. We were able to bring the remains back into the tomb, restore them as we did the other tombs, and restore the human remains. One of the things that we had were a lot of historic genealogical information on the family. We had photographs, as you saw, of Edwin Denison, but we could not find in all of our research a photograph or a painting of Mary B.P. Morgan. And it was sure it exists out there. We just have not been able to find it. So what we did is we worked with another colleague, Joe Mullins at George Mason University in the forensic science department, and using go back here, the CT scans of the skeletal remain of the craniums, he was able to now put a facial reconstruction to Mary. And so this is what we think she looked like. We certainly would love to find a photograph or a painting that can help us understand, see what she looked like and compare the two to see how well the reconstruction is. So the book tells these stories in far greater detail, and some of the things that happened to me inside the tombs. We write it in a way for the public, not it's not a scientific thesis, but we want you to feel like what it's like to be inside the tomb, should you want to, I suppose. But what it's like and how the archaeology went, how we did the forensic science, and how we were able to put closure to two criminal investigations, as well as the restoration of tombs. So these were such interesting projects. I decided I needed to write about them. The book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all other book outlets. It's published by Oxbow Books, a subsidiary of Oxford University Press. So it actually made its debut in Europe before it got to the United States. But Casemate at casematepublishers.com if you're at all interested. I'll leave that slide up, and with that, we'll be happy to enter. I'll stop sharing my screen. Here we go, and I'd be happy to take any questions any of you have.